if we look at AI today, that's looking at a Toyota in 1970. Like we have seen nothing yet.
This is Harvard Business School Professor Felix Oberholzer-Gee, one of the world's leading experts on competitive strategy.
When you're thinking about the employment effects, it's always two things.
The conversation is just getting started.
Maybe the biggest open question, big opportunity has to do with...
Every organization is asking the same question.
Oh, actually, the productivity of individuals who use new technology goes up. It doesn't go down.
The future of work is being rewritten right now.
Many people will just be more productive. But if there's good demand for these kinds of people will actually make more money.
This is the best news I've heard recently about this.
Welcome to the Parlor Room Presents Hello AI.
Before this episode starts, quick message for you. I'm coming to you from one of the weirdest, coolest places on campus, inside the chapel and the koi pond. I just wanted to say thank you for listening to this season of the Parlor Room, and please consider following the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Before AI became something you actively studied or taught, was there a moment when you first came across this new wave of AI?
Oh, yes. So I think I first started with summaries. And I found it incredibly helpful. I get sent a lot of books, I see a lot of articles, and there's no chance I can read everything. And so getting a first glimpse at, is it really interesting? Is it close to the research that I'm doing? That proved super helpful. And obviously it got better over time with, every release of a new model. The summaries became denser. I think they became more interesting also. They had more nuance. So that was maybe my first really positive experience. And then I also ran into trouble right away. So I'm the treasurer of a small building in New York where we live. And so the co-op is sort of a legal entity. It's a weird thing in housing markets. And we needed a new mortgage. And we don't, because it's such a small co-op, we don't really have formal financials. And so I thought, oh my God, I have AI. Mm-hmm. And so I took basically all the transactions that we had, and I wanted to create an income statement and a balance sheet. It was a total disaster.
Oh no, why was it
didn't work at all. So it couldn't even add up. I was so specific about this is the sum in column X row and so on and so on. And then the funniest thing was because it always got it wrong. And then at the end it asked me, so can you tell me the result?
Yeah, okay.
And I thought, I could, but that's not exactly how it's supposed to work. So it was both sort of really interesting and impressive. Mm-hmm. And then also it failed at things that humans wouldn't generally not really fail at. And I think this is, people now talk about the jagged front lines of AI, where it's really amazing at some things. And then other things, almost inexplicably, it fails in ways that are really surprising. And so that was exactly my first experience.
And imagine if a lot of people just trust what they get too. So someone might have just sent that off to their people that live in the building. They've been like, Felix has really got to get moved out of this position.
Yes, that's right.
Good thing you
or
caught
we
it.
may not have gotten the mortgage because we can't add up.
Oh boy.
Which is not a good idea.
The summaries, that was a positive experience.
Yeah.
When you did that, did it feel like something big was happening? Were you thinking, wow, this is pretty impressive? Or were you thinking, okay, I'm a little cautious here. What was the first impression of that?
It was impressive I think in two dimensions, the speed with which it would read and summarize. Mm-hmm. And now, of course, where we have the models where we can actually see what is happening in the background, that's even more impressive, how it just consumes vast amounts of data in basically no time at all. And I do remember you couldn't really trust the results completely. I mean, as you know, hallucinations have gone way down, even in the last year and a half or so. So not so much in the sense that it's literally wrong information, but say if I would ask, tell me a research paper that supports a particular point of view, it would give me the right set of research papers, but then when you read the papers, they don't actually say exactly what you'd expect it to read. So I think there is sort of, I think, which is the future anyway, like this machine-human collaboration where there's some things that the machine does really, really well. And then there's other things where humans are just much better. And it'll move over time. But I think collaboration between machine and humans is what the future is all about.
And you mentioned that it started to kind of show you what it was thinking along the way. I find that unsettling myself.
How so? Why?
Because I put it in and I was like, oh, this must be an error. Okay. I'm seeing behind the scenes. It's telling me what it's thinking. And then it says things like, I need to be honest. And I'm like, of course you need to be honest. Like the fact that you're checking that along the way, like that is crazy that I don't know if that's sent my way to be like shown to me. So I feel like, oh, it's really thinking about the right things, or if it truly is using those plot by plot directions. Because if it's using those plot by plot directions, I can see where the confidence drops, because you're like, some of these things should be just given. But it's telling me like accuracy is important. I'm thinking of obviously, but why is it telling me that? I know that.
Yeah.
So that part just makes me a little uncomfortable.
I guess it has two dimensions. One is, even when you download a document or when you save a document, it takes a little while. It's typically visualized.
Yeah.
And the reason that we do this is that it feels much less onerous. So you feel like, people are way more patient if they even see like a little circle that is basically nonsensical because you're waiting the same amount of time. But it's different because you're thinking, something is happening in the background, and it's looking up all of these documents.
Yeah.
And then the second thing to say is this is, of course, a little bit state of the art, right? That the big foundational models can do really amazing things. And I think one of the biggest tasks of the engineers at Google and Anthropic and everyone else is, how do you rein in what the model would do in a way that it gets closer to what users expect? So Gemini reportedly has around 1 million lines of code to rule out the kinds of things that AI might do if it was completely unsupervised.
Wow.
And so we should think that there's probably, depends a little bit which company we're talking about, but there's a year or maybe even 2 years worth of progress already exists in foundational models, but they're not released at this moment in time because the engineers are working on reining in what the model reasonably can do. So we have, I think, a big task in that these models can be really powerful, but they can also do many things that are undesirable. And I think sort of this back and forth, I think, is in part what you see, and in part what then creates the differences between the different models.
You mentioned speed a little bit a few minutes ago. A lot of AI feels like speed rather than real change. And like, how do you think about productivity gains that actually last and don't just fade?
Yeah.
And all you got was speed at something that dies out.
I think of speed as something very positive, and I'll give you an example. In Walmart fulfilling center, productivity has increased by about 30%. That means Walmart can do now much more business given the same warehouse infrastructure without hiring additional people. And that, of course, influences unit cost very dramatically. And eventually, probably some of that goes to the owners of Walmart, and some of that will be passed on to consumers. So the productivity gains that we start seeing now, many of them come from the fact that you can do things more quickly than it used to take you a long time to do X, Y, Z. I think JP Morgan had like 400 use cases of AI. And if you looked at what is actually happening here, many of them revolve around, we're doing the things that we've always done. We're just doing it much more quickly. The bigger question, I think, that is related to that. So say you're using AI for some tasks that you always done, and now you're 5 minutes faster. For productivity questions, of course, the big conundrum is like, what's going to happen with those 5 minutes? If you then think about the results for 5 minutes more carefully, that might be valuable. If you use it to eat your lunch a little more slowly, that might be good for your health, but it's probably not like super productive for the company. And so some of this, I think, is shifting time around, but some of this is already impacting unit economics actually in quite interesting and dramatic fashion. And one of the things that I see that is very interesting to me is some people's view of AI is that it's going to increase the willingness to pay of customers, which of course will be value creating. So that's really good. That's good for customers. That's good for the company also. But maybe at least at this moment in time, the more consistent gains will come from really boring things where unit costs fall by 10%, you get your results a little faster. So I would not be surprised, at least in the beginning phase of AI, that we see many things that just reduce cost. And then for companies, the big question is, so that's really amazing. Like 30% decrease in cost for a transaction in fulfillment centers at Walmart. That's a really big number. What if everybody does that?
Yeah.
And then, of course, we're back in this situation where we get technology. Everybody uses it in very similar ways. We get productivity gains in the beginning, and ultimately, because of competitive forces, most of these productivity gains will go to consumers. This is a little bit the history of technology since, say, the early 1990s. If I show you total labor productivity in the economy over time, what you would see is like really dramatic ups and downs that correspond essentially to the business cycle. So the big 2008, 2009 recession, you see COVID really, like it's a really big change in productivity, but you don't see technology. So it's not as though we went from an average of 2% productivity gain per year to now 3 or 4 or 5. There's no acceleration. And in part, I think it's because so many of the benefits ultimately went to consumers, because companies did things in more efficient ways, but everybody started using Outlook, and everybody started using SAP, and everybody started using like a very similar set of tools. And that means, yes, we can do much more, but who benefits in the end? Not really the companies and the shareholders. Many of these benefits went to consumers. Obviously, nothing wrong with that, but it does open up this question if both the production of LLMs, but also the applications, if they tend to be really expensive, the return on these investments are not completely clear. And so much will depend on, can companies find ways to deploy AI in a way that is differentiated from the competition?
So differentiation will definitely help for sure. But are there other things people are missing along the way? Like the benefits going to the customer, like we said, that's great. Are there things that they're missing at the same time besides differentiation that they should be thinking about as well? Or is it truly just standing out from the rest because we're all using the same tools now?
I would say maybe the biggest open question, big opportunity has to do with if you automate the processes as they exist today, you'll get a little bit of more efficient, and that's nice. And in particular, if everybody around you is doing it, you better do that as well, because otherwise you fall behind very quickly. But if you look at the history of technology, actually most of the gains, most of the time, came from reinventing the processes. So I'll give you like an age-old example. So you remember Edison invents the light bulb in the late 19th century. And then actually quite amazingly, in a very short period after that, there's a power plant in Manhattan. And so electric power, there's a market, electric power comes available. And you think, oh my God, this is going to change everything. You look 20 years after electric power comes available, less than 10% of factories actually are using any sort of electricity. And the question is, that is such an obvious, novel, interesting piece of technology. Like, what is it about these companies that they don't understand that they can do many things with electric power that they cannot do with steam?
Yeah.
Now, think about what a factory looks like at that moment. You have a central steam engine that produces power. And then from that central steam engine, you use basically connections to drive all the individual machinery. So what if you just replace that central steam engine with an electric motor, there's a little bit of a benefit. You don't have to worry about coal and all of that stuff, but the benefits are really small. Where do the big benefits come from? So once people realize, if I use electric power, actually I can now have a motor at each machine and reconfigure the whole production process. That then brings the big productivity gains. And that's a little bit the way to think about AI today. If you superimpose AI on the processes that we have today, you're a little faster, maybe you're a little better, your cost might go down, but it's not going to be the big thing. The big thing will come from rethinking what these processes need to look like in the first place. So I'll give you one example. If we onboard someone, how do we make sure this new person actually understands what we do, does the work in good quality, even though, the person hasn't really been in the job all that long? The answer is process. We tell you, okay, so, here's a customer order, and this is what happens next, and so on and so on. So we've tied quality to a particular way of doing things. Now, one of the big strengths of AI is that it can figure out how to do things radically different. I mean, that's sort of interesting about the history of AI more generally. If you think back to Deep Blue, like the first supercomputer that beat human at playing chess, it's essentially a superhuman. So it plays chess like a human person, and the only difference is really that it's incredibly fast. It can look at tens of thousands of potential combinations and moves in ways that humans just cannot. But the really big breakthrough comes much later when Google and others try their hand at chess and Go, where the process is largely unspecified. AI figures out how best to play chess, how best to play Go, and that's sort of the metaphor to keep in mind. I think we've always had technology that ultimately required us to rethink what these processes look like. But now, interestingly, I think for the first time we have technology where actually maybe I don't really have to think about what the processes are. Maybe I can let the technology figure out, like you get, I don't know, a stack of resumes with applications, and I have a way to review these applications. Maybe AI can do it in a very different way. And the intuition to have is that usually you can tell the technology, what does good look like? So say if I had really big success with hiring a particular type of person, just specify this is what success looks like. The way we did it when we taught AI to play a game. This is how you win. This is what success looks like. And then how exactly it's going to do it, I think, well, we will not know. And that, I'm guessing, will make people like you a little uncomfortable.
It will make
because
you
you like to know what is happening under the hood. But, as long as the results are great.
Yeah.
Like, why worry about the process?
Can't
right?
complain if you're using and you're happy with the
that's
results.
right.
Where do you see AI creating the earliest and like most reliable productivity gains in organizations?
So there's definitely big progress in when you think coding, right? It's like you look at companies like PayPal says their developer productivity is up anywhere between 10 and 30%. So I think that's an obvious application. Anywhere where you need to consume large amounts of data in a short period of time and get reliable summaries, I think that's a really interesting area. And I think the part that is already very interesting, so now people think, oh, AI can do it much more quickly and, we increase productivity. And then before you know it, we will all be out of jobs.
Yeah.
And then you look at the data. In the last 3 years, in the U.S. economy, I should say, we added about 3 million white-collar jobs. We added 7% software engineers, 10% radiologists, 20% paralegals. Exactly in the
That's the one we hear
areas where you think, oh my God, it's like, oh, catastrophe impending.
Yeah.
And then you have to look at the data. No,
so
not
that's the
really.
one specifically everyone uses as an example
That's right.
that will be replaced.
That's exactly right.
Why are we getting that wrong?
So maybe I'll tell you another history.
I love history
story.
lessons.
Okay, good. So imagine old-fashioned bank.
Yep.
Part of what bank tellers do, what keeps them really busy, is dealing with cash.
Oh, so this isn't the old-fashioned Wild West with the thing on their head.
Okay,
I was imagining that bank. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Old-fashioned 1980s, 90s bank. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, we're not going back
Okay.
quite as far.
Okay.
But so, they're like really busy. People come in, pick up cash, the businesses bring back cash, and so on and so on. And then the ATM comes along.
Yeah.
And everybody thinks, oh my God, bank tellers, doomed, like no chance. And then you look at the data, and over the next 20 years, we're adding a lot of bank tellers. You go, what on earth is going on?
Yeah.
And I think it's very similar to what's going on in software and so on and so on. So the story is twofold. As ATMs come along, the cost of operating branches falls. And so banks have many more branches than they used to have. And then we shift what bank tellers do from something like handing out cash, which is really not that valuable for the bank, to giving advice, to encouraging investment, and so on and so on. So what you should imagine, like when you're thinking about the employment effects, it's always two things. If any sort of technology drives down the cost, and if ultimately we pass on some of these savings to consumers, demand will rise. And so we get more business activity. That alone, I think, cushions a little bit against big employment losses. And then the second thing that's always happened in technology is that actually, the productivity of individuals who use new technology goes up. It doesn't go down. You can do more and you can do smarter, better things. Like I used to hand out cash. Now I can give investment advice. And as a result, actually, both the number of jobs and very often the compensation goes up. It's exactly what we see in software today. Compensation goes up very quickly. Why? Because, now having a software developer who can actually use all the AI tool, you just have more output, and the more output is more valuable. And in a semi-tight labor market, we can sometimes pay people less than their marginal productivity, but generally speaking, if you try to understand why is it that some people make more money than others, I think looking at differences in productivity is a good first step. And so your expectation should be, yes, there might be jobs that are negatively affected where we use fewer people, but the bigger story for sort of white-collar work in general is probably that many, many people will just be more productive. And if the labor market is maybe not super tight, but if there's good demand for these kinds of people will actually make more money.
This is the best news I've heard recently about this. So I'm quite happy to hear your version of things I'm fully subscribing to.
So I should say there's academic research out there that talks about these entry-level positions that we do away with. And the evidence is not as clear cut because it actually, the paper that has become quite famous starts about a year and a half before even the release of OpenAI. Think of every job as a bundle of tasks. There's really no such thing as a job. Like every job includes many different tasks.
Okay.
And if you happen to have the kind of job where every task can be automated, I think we will see far fewer positions and probably you're not going to get paid that well. There's some indication that in the market for back office work, that has started to become visible. But for most tasks, it will be parts that you can automate and then other parts where human judgment remains important. One of my favorite examples is air traffic controllers. So air traffic controllers now use pretty amazing technology to make sure, we don't get collisions and so on and so on. And so their most important task revolves sort of around these edge cases. It looks a little dicey, should we not? Is it a problem? Is it not a problem? And so essentially it's this collaboration between air traffic controllers and a lot of data and a lot of machinery and a lot of history that we have. But because air traffic controllers now provide these incredibly valuable services, their compensation has actually gone up dramatically. Wow. And so that's sort of a glimpse of the future, I think, where we will have lots and lots of jobs. I mean, it's already true. The general notion is, if you look over the last 30 years or so, there are hundreds and hundreds of jobs that didn't really exist before computers, because computers generated new types of jobs. Already today in AI, we have, I guess, what we now call forward deployed engineers who help companies implement AI products in the context of that industry or in the context of that business. That's not really a job we had before. And who knows how labor intensive this is. You have to go in. And yes, some of it you can probably automate. Like, how do I don't know, create data pools and so on, so on. There's elements that are open to automation. But then the judgment, is this client going to face a revolt if I try to do X? Does this particular implementation match the general culture that there's so much judgment at one and the same time. And so I think these forward deployed engineers, they will have good human skills to sort of read situations, understand corporate cultures, and then see how technology can best be deployed. That is so much harder to automate. And so for a long time, we will see that these people are really valuable.
Wow. Now, if you looked at your position, someone sitting here and they're looking at their job as a bundle of tasks.
Yeah.
And they're seeing some things that are, there's a good amount of automation possibility here in my bundle of tasks. What's a question or what's a system that they can go through themselves to say, how do I fix this problem?
Maybe the first thing to think about is if we look at AI today, that's looking at a Toyota in 1970. And I think a first mistake is to say, oh, look, it can now do X. I'm totally okay because X. No, we're looking at, you're looking at that 1970s Toyota. I don't even know, did Toyotas exist in the 70s?
Yeah, I'm sure they did.
Okay, good, excellent.
I'm sure
good.
They did.
Yes. So we're looking at a way early version. We have seen nothing yet. These systems will become so much better. And so I would say, if you're thinking about the bundle of tasks that you perform and you see that the technology cannot do a particular set of things, I think that's the basis to believe that, you'll be really valuable. And probably as your productivity goes up, you'll be, say, project managers are in crazy demand right now.
Yeah.
Because project management is exactly, in the life of a project manager, no day looks exactly like the other day. There's always like all this stuff happening. So that is like, you should feel pretty confident. If you're thinking, no, actually, my day is sort of pretty much the same every day, and I do the same set of tasks. And right now, AI is really terrible at doing these tasks. That should not give you a huge amount of confidence simply because the models will become so much better.
That's a good point. Now, just since you brought that up, is there anything that people are trying to make happen for AI right now and it's not ready or it's not working well?
I mean, it's the degree to which it can reliably give you something that looks like human judgment. That is still super hard, right?
Yeah.
Because humans are doing something pretty darn complicated. And in part it's because, stick 5 humans in a room or I should probably say stick 93 humans in a room and ask them for judgment. That's the HBS classroom. And you will never get agreement because this is like a super hard thing to do. And so I always encourage everyone who's working with AI, just think of it like if you're in a meeting and your smartest friend says something, you probably have priors that, he's a really smart person, like I should give the view or that opinion a decent amount of consideration, but you wouldn't think this person's always right or this person always knows better. And AI is exactly like that. It throws out pretty reasonable suggestions often, but of course, just like when we interact with other humans, it's like, sometimes it's great and sometimes it's not so great. And so I think for quite a long time in areas where there is a lot of judgment, there's a lot of surprise. Imagine like if we took like a project manager and we were trying to automate that person's life. Super, super hard to do. I mean, bits and pieces, yes, of course. But like the thing that the project manager never really thought about it, and it's happening against all expectations. That's going to be surprising to the person and surprising to the technology.
Can we play a quick game?
Of course.
All right. So what I'd like to do. Okay, so I've got these paddles.
Okay.
Now, just to start it off, we're just talking about there's a lot of hype with AI going on right now. And if we talk about this as overrated or underrated, is the hype overrated, underrated, or just about right for different kinds of things? So I'm going to name a few common ways companies are using AI at work.
Okay.
And for each one, I'd like you to tell me whether you think it's overrated, underrated, or just about right now.
Okay.
The hype part of it, all right? So here, you've got these.
Okay.
And for the people watching at home, they can see these people listening home. We're going to announce as well.
Yeah. And I assume I have to explain myself.
I would like it if you did. Otherwise, we might get the wrong idea.
That's the bad.
All right, so let's go
That's
through
the bad news.
Scenario 1. AI writing internal emails and documents. Is that hype about that right now? Overrated, underrated, or just about right?
I think that's if the hype is AI can do the vast majority of emails. So I'll give you a.
You said just about right, just for the people listening at home.
Yeah, just about right.
Yeah.
I give you a good example. For reasons that are not totally clear to me, I get a lot of email from prospective PhD students who basically just write, Mr. So-and-so, I'm interested in your PhD program. Can you tell me more? And of course, my answer is always, well, it's very nice that you're interested in our PhD program. And guess what? There's a website that will actually tell you almost everything. So that kind of thing, of course, I no longer answer these myself because there's a very polite and nice and encouraging way to answer, but it's always the same.
It's obvious.
It doesn't really change. And so for that, I think for all that kind of communication, there's no hype. I think
it's just about
all of this will be automated.
Okay. Scenario 2. Are you ready?
Okay.
I would like to say they're going to get harder, but I'm actually not sure if they're going to get harder. All right. AI summarizing meetings instead of people attending live.
Oh, I think
just about right again?
Just about right. I think it's near perfect now.
Really?
One of the things that I have found is So you have a summary of a meeting,
Mm-hmm.
and it's pretty good at sort of summarizing where everybody came out. We agreed on like 7 things, and the 7 things you'll see, but it doesn't give a good sort of sense of the back and forth, or it doesn't give a good sense of the differences in opinions. You can now just go back and say, give me more nuance.
And it will do that?
Give me a sense of the pros and cons on the 7 points that you just listed. And it will do that. There's research out of MIT that has sort of these iterative prompting techniques where you feel like, but I heard, if I remember right, there was like a pretty powerful counter argument, and I don't really see it. Just ask, like, what was the what was the counter argument to what we decided? Or for each of the points where we came out, give me like the 2 most important pluses, the 2 most important negatives, and it will do that. It will do that beautifully.
See, that I would have thought you'd say overhyped, because the nuance part does scare me. If I think about, like, if I get a message from a friend and I tell them, I send them a text message maybe, and I say, we'll meet at 2:00 and the kids are gonna, play soccer or whatever. And is that okay with you? And they respond, yep, like YEP. I'll look at them like, yep. That seems dismissive. They must be mad at me. They would say yes if they wanted to do this and they were happy with this plan, but they said yep. And then I'll go into this thing internally being like, did I phrase this incorrectly? And then I think, I'm reading the context wrong because it's text.
Yeah.
And I'm not getting who knows what they were doing. The meeting notes feel like a wildfire for those kind of missed cues for me. So I wonder, nothing's saying, I don't think, the saying like, Rachel was quiet the entire meeting. She obviously wasn't happy with what was going on. Or Thomas used a dismissive tone or something like those are things I'm going to pick up in a room or in a Zoom room or whatever that I'm afraid is going to be missing. It's going to be the yep over and over again. I'm going to there's 40 yeps in this thing.
Yeah.
I think everyone's mad. Yeah. And I'd miss that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will say part of it is, of course, what's the data that you capture? Mm-hmm. We're not quite there yet, but so you will have video of the meetings in the future, and you will see, a person with folded arms who looks angry, and so on and so on. You will see like who doesn't speak up, and so on and so on. So that I think like we're fairly close to having these kinds of models. Of course, does every perception that you have in a meeting, all the information that you pick up, is that going to be reflected in that document? I think the answer is no. But now think about, we're in a meeting with 5 people, and we ask everybody to summarize. Everybody's experience of that meeting will have been different, right? And so this goes back to think about AI as a really smart person in the room. And that description of the meeting is not exactly your experience, but it's also probably not so different from what other people thought about the same interaction.
You probably wouldn't walk away with wrong information. You'd walk away with a variation on the same understanding.
Yeah, and always, I think one of the really fascinating things is if you're unhappy with what you get, I mean, the models already are incredibly good at responding to, I need more detail, I need the dissenting views, I need to know, like give me a sense of the time that we spend talking about X, Y, Z. So I would often say with bigger, when I try to decide should I read a book or not. So I have AI read the book. And then I don't really have a sense. The summary doesn't give me a good sense. Like, did it dwell on 2 of these points? Basically, like the book is like 2 of these points, and I happen to be not interested in these 2 points. So I want to know. And you can definitely go back and say, is that like how much space does it take up? Like,
that's interesting.
Really, is that really important? So, in a way, the trick is to treat it like a person.
Yeah.
And what you would add, like if you tell me, like, did you read book XYZ? And then I talk to you a little bit about the book. The next logical thing for you is to then ask 13 follow-up questions. And I think the same is true. The same is true for AI.
Yeah, I think the back and forth is a part I'm not thinking about as much. So I'm thinking, all right, I'm going to read the summary or get the summary and I'm going to miss it. But the point you just made, which I hadn't thought about, asking back, like, how often did we talk about this? Did anyone bring up that? Using it more like not just a one-way street, but a two-way street. I don't know why I didn't think of it as a two-way street.
Yeah.
It does become a better idea as a two-way street.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the number 3 scenario. So remember, I
have these
you've got your panel.
underused
It's okay. If they have to be underused, they have to be underused. So is this overrated, underrated, or about right on the hype scale right now? AI helping leaders decide which projects to stop or prioritize. Is that overhyped, underhyped, or just about right now?
So I'm not sure about if the claim is it can perfectly do that, that claim is not right.
So that would be overhyped if they're saying you can rely on this thing, no questions asked.
Yeah.
Okay.
For exactly the reasons that I think one good way to think about two colleagues of mine, they had this interesting way of thinking about, when should you rely on AI and when is it okay not to do so? So Andy Wu and Bharat Anand, they have the source of information is sort of explicit data that you have somewhere versus tacit knowledge, like the history of experiences that this particular executive has. That's like a body of knowledge that is incredibly important deciding, should I buy the company, should I not buy the company? But it's not data that you can easily access. It's an intuition, it's a sense that you have, it's human judgment. And then the other dimension that they talk about is like, how costly is it if you're wrong? And even though it's like a super simple 2x2, anything that is sort of in that there's a lot of tacit knowledge, probably AI will perform not quite as well as, the typical human person who has a lot of experience, which doesn't automatically mean you shouldn't use it, because then you ask, okay, so it's probably not going to be very good. Is it costly if I make a mistake? And the answer is no, actually, it'll be okay. Then, of course, I can still use it if it's the acquisition of a company and I get it wrong because I had AI decide. Then that's probably not a place. So this goes back a little bit to thinking about jobs as bundles of tasks. The more tasks rely on tacit knowledge, I think the harder it will be to really take the human out of the equation.
Good. All right. AI forecasting demand or sales currently right now, if it's saying it can forecast, it's got it under control, is that overhyped, underhyped, or just about right?
So I think actually it's even better than we know that many people don't really trust it that much. So you see it in debates around scheduling people and scheduling workers. It's been true for quite some time that both traditional methods already, but then AI definitely can do a much, much better job than humans.
So I think that's considered underhyped then.
Yeah.
We can get a lot more out of that.
But somehow many people so think about retail where we have this complicated scheduling mess. Many managers who do this, it's sort of a big part of their job and they think they have good intuition and they sort of know, when it's raining, I use fewer people and Kathy and Robert probably shouldn't work together because they don't like each other, and so on. It's like all of these kinds of things. But actually, the reality, that much of the research shows no. It's like the manager is not better. And so I would say this is even like technology, even before AI, and with AI, definitely, it can just forecast things in ways that are really hard for humans, and also say if you're thinking about pricing models, because your prices change in response to the prices of competitors, and that happens like a million times a day if everybody, like say competition between e-commerce companies, and there's pretty good academic evidence that if you do it more often and if you do it more quickly, that actually gives you a competitive advantage relative to people who move more slowly.
All right, let's move on to the last one. AI screening or ranking job candidates, as it stands right now, is it overrated, underrated, or just about right? Screening and ranking of job candidates.
So I have a project. It's early days.
Okay.
Where we trained a model to mimic the decisions of HR managers, and it's doing that pretty reliably. Like if you get like a stack of resumes, and we ran these tests, where the humans choose who are the 10 best candidates, and the machine chooses super close. But this is also an example of, because we know we're not very good at picking the right people, this is like a good example of maybe we should have a completely different process to do this. So one of the things we're trying now, I don't know, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't work. We fed in the productivity of individual teams into the model. And the idea was, don't pick just like a really good candidate who looks good. Think about ultimately what we want is productivity of that team. Pick the candidate you think makes the biggest contribution to team productivity. So now we're basically saying, like, don't think like a typical HR manager or a hiring manager. Think about what does good look like. And here in this particular case, good is just like high productivity. And can we somehow expect that, I don't know, AI picks up on things that we don't pick up? And so the first indications that we have is it now picks different people from the HR managers. So it's no longer doing what humans used to do. We don't know. It's too early to say whether whatever it's doing will turn out to be better than what humans can do. But you see, like now all of a sudden, before it was basically the same people, and now there's like this interesting difference, and that's maybe sort of the right way to push forward with messy processes where we have a process in place, but the process itself is like, it's sort of working okay, not that great. Maybe trying to figure out whether AI can do a better job, I think is a good thing to try.
All right. So I think you see opportunity there. So you must think it's slightly underhyped right now. There's more to it.
So I would say there's probably upside. I can't know because there's so few cases where people are really serious about letting AI reinvent. And you also get, so Google created a product that ultimately didn't really find that much appeal with newsrooms. But the idea was every journalist comes to work in the morning and you spend quite a bit of time just figuring out, okay, my reporting today, like what should I write about? What if AI already prepared the universe of things that has happened from all the sources that are out there? And then it gave you 10 potential stories. And because we know journalists have standards that are really hard to emulate, we still let you do all the reporting. But even that tool, again, I was recently in a newsroom conversation, even that tool, sort of the idea that AI would at least prepare the topics for you, it wasn't really all that popular. And so I think this is the other thing that we will see, where it's going to be applied and how it's going to be applied. As always, doesn't really have to do that much with the technology. It has a little to do with what the technology can do and what it cannot do, but it also just has a lot to do with like what's the human response to, what's the organizational response to the changes that come along with new technology.
When AI does improve productivity, what has to be true in order for those gains to stick?
And maybe if I can add, if I can twist your question a little bit, yeah. I think the productivity gains will stick. But the big question is who benefits, right? Is it the company and the shareholders who paid for the technology, or is it the consumer? And I think this goes back to the early conversation around differentiation. If we can't figure out how to use AI in a fashion that is differentiated from everybody else, then it'll be really great for consumers. Like so many things will be so much cheaper. I give you an incredible example. As you probably know, youth unemployment is quite high in China right now. So in particular, if you're a graduate from an engineering program, it's like super, super hard. The government tells us youth unemployment is somewhere in the 20% or so. We don't even really know if that's true or not. So what do all of these engineers do? Like totally amazing. Like instead of collecting unemployment insurance, they all start their own companies. And because they're engineers, and because robotics is so big in China, they all have studied and learned robotics. It's the HBS Club of Shanghai organized a conference, and I met some of these entrepreneurs at that conference. Like everybody has like 17 ideas, robots plus AI, what they could do. And sometimes it's really, so like one guy explained to me, when car companies build a new seat, what you want to make sure is that seat is going to stay comfortable for a long period of time, because people spend a lot of time in their cars. So right now we have like these robots that basically mimic people sitting down like 5 million times to really know if the design is good. With AI, you can do this much more quickly and much more effectively. I don't really know, but his claim was about 10% of the time that it took to simulate all because you get feedback from the test, and then AI can decide relatively quickly, for this kind of movement, the seat is actually totally okay, but it looks a little dicey when you do different things. And because there's now this added intelligence to this process, you can actually test new designs of car seats in a fraction of the time. And so that's fantastic, right? So that lowers the cost of the car manufacturer. And if in fact it's only one car manufacturer that now has this technology, really great. If tomorrow everybody does the same thing, cars will be cheaper. So either way, it's good for someone, but the big question is, where will the big gains flow? Is the AI story mostly a story where you and I, will meet over beer and just say, do you remember how expensive stuff used to be? We used to pay so much for all of these ridiculous products and services, and now it's not exactly free, but almost free. Or is it that because humans become so productive with AI that most of the benefits flow to people who work productively with AI? They have like a ton of income, but maybe product prices don't really come back because we re-engineer the jobs in ways that make them really valuable for many companies. So I think the big value creation, I think, is almost a given. The more interesting and more complicated question is like, where will it flow? Will value stick with the companies? Will it go to consumers? Will it go to people who work in smart ways with AI? And I think we'll see a big variety, in some places where it really goes straight to the consumer, and some places where it's probably good for people who work with the technology.
I have this thought. It feels pretty solid in my head, and I might be wrong. But I should say that
That's true. That's true for about half the thoughts that I have in mind.
Right. I feel like that should be a new thing I say before I say any sentence to anybody. But this idea of differentiation and advantage, it doesn't seem like it could exist going forward. You can be the first to something, it feels like, but anything technology-based, it's just a matter of time, be it an hour or a year, someone else can do the exact same thing. Like, doesn't it feel like we're kind of just on either a slow or a fast track to sameness across the board and no differentiation?
So the traditional sources of stickiness or of the difficulty of imitating, they remain as always. So scale, I think, if it comes in the form of fixed costs, creating economies of scale, or network effects, if it comes in the form of the more people use a particular product, the more valuable it becomes. So that, I think, the technology will not change at all. And then the question is, just on the ideation part, like how much, what role will ideation play? And I think you already see pretty good and convincing evidence that in some of the entrepreneurship contests that exist, they now have, teams that don't work with AI, teams that work with AI, and then AI freestanding, like no human involvement. And already it becomes visible that every now and then AI has really great and powerful ideas. And so if we're thinking about going back to this analogy, AI is just a smart person somewhere else. Actually, in expectation, that will increase the number of new and novel ideas that we have. And it'll be sometimes what the mistake that humans often make in that thinking, but I'm going to do it somehow better. And you already look at it and say, no, but there's like 18 people who already work on this idea. Chances that you just imitate so that we get these waves of imitation. Maybe AI is a way to get less of that, because we can say, okay, so, you better think of a better idea that is not exactly what everybody else is doing.
Yeah.
And so in that world population will shrink relatively quickly now because people decided not to have kids. And one worry is that in a smaller population, we will have fewer really big ideas, because we're just fewer people. And as a result, the kind of wealth increases over time that we have historically seen in the last 200 years or so, they will become smaller and smaller, because we just, if you and I are left, well, okay, so we're probably not going to invent anything really big. And maybe AI is in part a way out of that dilemma, so that we can substitute for the smaller numbers of people who have ideas by using technology and asking technology to come up with new stuff.
That's an interesting way to look at it. And you started so positive, Felix, and then you brought up that we're going to lose population, and now we're going back down again. We talked about that once before. That always makes me sad. Okay. Are there ways that AI can look productive, but long-term it actually is worse for an organization?
You can imagine people falling in love with the activity, right? So interacting with AI endless, and maybe you'll have really drawn out ideation processes that in the end don't really lead to anything really big. Mm-hmm. I mean, because the way we interact right now, that we speak to it or that we type, it's not like, the most amazing of ways to interact with technology. So I think that will definitely change, so that we, can interact in ways that the way we interact with humans, and so on and so on. So going back to the meeting example, but generally speaking, then of course, if that becomes, say, already now, like if you want that, the models can be like incredibly funny. The models can be, people who fall in love with their bots. The models can be, feel like your romantic partner. If that happens, it's a little bit like people wasting time on Facebook and Instagram and TikTok when they're at work.
Sure.
And so much of that, I think, is not really different from earlier technologies, in that if we can get people to use it in the most productive ways, we'll benefit. If people use it as a really fantastic distraction, then we need to think about how to manage that tension.
Now, I've got a story for you then that
right.
ties this in. In a previous episode, I was talking to Jeff Busgang.
Okay.
And I pitched him a horrible idea. I'd like to say on purpose. I'll say it was on purpose. But I wanted to test the AI model afterwards because I pitched this before I thought about how these models work, but to talk about like maybe leading you down the wrong road. So I pitched an app called Holy Rollers.
Okay.
And for those of you who've heard this before, I apologize. It's a sermon sharing app for religious leaders.
Okay.
So a rabbi can write a great sermon, and then they put it up on Holy Rollers. You have to be a member. I think it's probably $9.99 a month. And then a priest somewhere could be like, that's a pretty good sermon, and I'm just going to take that and hit Catholicize, and it turns into my thing.
Oh, okay.
And we share it. It's a really bad idea.
How so? I love it. I think it's a
It's
great
a bad
idea.
I think it's a bad idea because I think now you don't
Why?
even need it. But to do my test, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna pitch this to ChatGPT,
Okay.
and it told me it was such a good idea, and I kept saying, try to be more critical,
Yeah.
and it was critical in certain parts, but it kept giving me workarounds to make it still work.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I could try to make Holy Rollers for the next 6 months. It would be a huge waste of my time. And that I could see like companies could be doing that all over the place right now.
I mean, so this is not exactly the same, but think about the apps that we have today where teachers share lesson plans, which is not so different from your idea,
Holy
where
Rollers.
basically it worked somewhere else, and maybe I tweak it a little bit, but I don't know that much about religion, but if I'm guessing you do this all the time, maybe every day.
I think every week you got to have a new sermon.
Week. Yeah, so 52 ideas.
Yeah.
So yes, of course, instead of you're starting from scratch, if you could add a twist to something that was really great, I think that's fantastic.
You just changed it. It's not Catholicized, it's Catholic twist. And then it's Protestant twist. That seems more user-friendly and fun that way.
Yes, exactly.
But
so what's wrong? Why is
I
it
think
a
it's
bad
a bad
idea?
I think it's a bad idea, but I think I honestly do. But
I mean, I wouldn't pay $9.99 because I'm not religious. But if I was a priest,
$4.99. But I guess my point is that it's hard to, at least from my experience, because I've tried a couple things where I've tried to just be like, talk me out of this.
Yeah.
And it doesn't quite talk me out of it. It always kind of gives me a workaround to, but you could try this. That feels not dangerous because it's not. It's you can do whatever you want with it. But it feels like you could waste a lot of time chasing bad things because it's not critical. At least many of these aren't critical, even when you ask them to be critical.
Yeah. So this is a super interesting question because it goes back a little bit to the economic incentives of the companies that provide the foundational models. You might remember this is now maybe almost a year ago, where an update to almost all the models left all these models with, way too much agreeing with their users. And eventually the companies pulled it back and they added more criticism. But this is a little bit this old age. Well, I shouldn't say it's not that old, but say think about social media. So my job is to entertain and to make connections, but I also want you to spend endless time on my app because it's advertising financed, and the more time you spend and so on and so on. And that's basically how we created the mental health crisis for teenagers. The economic or financial interests of the companies that build the foundational models, of course, they play a huge role. So if the average person likes the fact that the model mostly agrees, or sometimes you can ask for criticism, but say it's friendlier than your boss. Well, if I'm developing one of these models, I'm customer oriented. I'm going to give you what you want. This again, I think, is no different from if you work for a boss and the boss likes to be flattered. People will flatter the boss in ways that he likes. So I don't know that there's anything unusual or special about it, but it does make us think: Are there applications? Are there ways where we don't really know how the models are. We don't really have a model how to monetize all the investments that happen right now. And so it could be that it's advertising financed, in which case I want you to spend endless time on the app. It could be, so OpenAI now seems to go down the road to have it more linked to e-commerce, which I found completely surprising because e-commerce is a terrible business to be in with with really horrible margins, but somehow that seems to be their new best idea. And depending on how exactly they will be monetized, we can then start thinking about, is that mode of monetization, does it somehow sort of push us in a direction that is less than perfectly healthy or less than perfectly useful, to the extent that companies buy and implement the AI software and they have mostly an interest in productivity. I think the LLMs have a healthy interest in producing things that are productive. I would probably worry much more about the B2C market. B2B, I think, it might not be perfect, but they're probably going to be okay. They might create switching costs that are higher than they really need to be, because that makes the business more profitable. But I would be much more worried about what is happening in the B2C market, where individuals decide. And if you see it a little bit with the bots that become romantic partners. If that's something, maybe I don't have the number of friends I would love to have, and I feel a little lonely. And if that's like a good way to make me feel less lonely, companies will definitely cater to that. And I think it's a super interesting question about all the edtech companies that are starting now using AI. Is really we want to experiment on the next generation of kids, what works and what doesn't work. I think I would have the biggest hesitation actually in the consumer market, not so much in the B2B market.
The kid part is very concerning and often used as guinea pigs and things like that. It's unsettling.
And I mean, we made this huge mistake with social media, right? With really dramatic consequences. Mm-hmm. And now the question is, now we're getting around. I think France is now the second country that thinks about banning social media for all children. Australia already has a ban, but it's 10 years after we had solid. In a way, it's not totally different from smoking, right? Mm-hmm. Where we look back and we say, well, actually, these guys knew long before it became public knowledge that what they're doing is really terrible. Yeah. And it's no different for Meta. Like Meta knew long time ago that all the negative consequences of social media, in particular for young girls. Yeah. And of course, they didn't act on it. So I think that is a real debate to have, how to use AI, but also how to teach the next generation of kids to use it in a way that is really productive and that is really stimulating. I mean, it will change. So I had this interesting conversation about. Someone said, well, what's most important is that anytime anything is touched by AI, that you disclose it so that I know. And I asked, do you disclose when you use a spell checker? And the answer is, of course, no. It's like, yeah, of course we're using spell checkers. Like, no one knows how to spell, and it's totally okay. Yeah. So how exactly is AI different from the spell checker? Isn't it just that it would be such a waste of time to teach anyone how to spell, because it's just not necessary. But and maybe AI will have a similar effect in that it sort of shifts the boundaries of what you need to be able to do. but it increases the kinds of things you need to do, and it now includes, responsible interaction with a really powerful technology. And so I would love it if we would be really serious in thinking about. So be careful, I think, one, because we don't really know the consequences, but then be really serious about can we teach kids, just like we can teach kids how to read newspapers carefully and skeptically about what they read. Can we teach that same skepticism? Can we teach that same responsible handling of AI? I think we can. I don't always see in the many applications we have for children already. We don't always see that. I don't always see that that's sort of like the guiding thought that people have.
If we switch back to productivity and AI, is there anything that kind of, it doesn't sound great, but just anything that's like super exciting that you think about with AI and how it's going to help with productivity, and the opposite, things that make you think, oof, I'd like to steer clear of that?
Yeah. I think drug discovery is an amazing opportunity.
Yeah.
So I have a good colleague who works in drug discovery. Like, his description is that basically what you would do in your first year as a PhD student, that has completely gone away.
Wow.
And so that's super exciting. The part that I find most interesting about that is sometimes we get these really big productivity gains and we think that's really amazing. And then you always want to think about is, doesn't it just shift the bottleneck somewhere else? So right now the bottleneck is it takes us forever to discover new drugs. And that's really not great. And, that part goes away. But now, like when we test the drugs, when we, start with small samples to make sure it's safe for humans and so on, doesn't the bottleneck just shift from discovery to now? We definitely don't have a system that is based on like super fast testing on large groups of people. Like, so I would say always say these two things. Like, think about where AI can really, really make a big, big difference. And I think drug discovery is definitely one of these things. But then think about the system as a whole, and where are the bottlenecks? If all of a sudden this thing blows up, is there going to be somewhere else in the system where we get new bottlenecks? And I think sometimes it's probably going to be not really like that. It's just a much better system.
But just be aware that bottlenecks may be created elsewhere because of this.
May be created elsewhere because we haven't really built the system because forever it used to take a very long time to discover drugs. And so the rest of the apparatus is just not, the FDA is not set up for us to discover new drugs in rapid fire succession.
Now, that's great. Do you want to use the bottleneck as the negative? You were talking about like the positive and negative, or do you want to think of a different thing?
Not a negative, but to sort of say, if we want the overall productivity gains, just fixing one issue with the help of AI is probably not going to do it, because you'll just run into other problems somewhere else. Like, say, autonomous driving is a good example. So we built the software. And, it's getting pretty good. I think eventually we will get very close to autonomous driving. I was recently in San Francisco. It took me forever to get from A to B. It was so slow. Why? Well, because humans have figured out you can be really nasty to robotaxis.
Oh, wow.
Everybody cuts in.
Yeah,
and when they cut in, of course, you're all, because the software was built on precaution.
Yeah. And
we didn't really think, okay, so like, how is it going to interact with? We were so focused on making it safe, knowing that, any accident, even though, humans are terrible at driving to begin with. The bar is actually fairly low.
Sure, I agree.
But that, of course, is irrelevant. I think the public reaction to accidents, say, half the frequency of humans would already be like completely unacceptable. I'm absolutely sure that would kill off the technology. So there was good reason to be extra careful. But we haven't really thought about, okay, so now in the real world, in the interaction, like if everybody is like really nasty because they know you are the most careful driver in human history, that actually makes the technology then much less. So we get a productivity gain because we don't have to have a driver, and then we get like super slow movement because of the bottleneck just shifts somewhere else.
Yeah, that's it. It moves somewhere else. So you basically had to carry everyone else's bags. You were like the guy who was picked on. That's
yeah, I'm telling you, it was like, I mean, it was quite a bit of traffic anyway.
Yeah.
But then also it was quite fascinating to me that maybe in San Francisco, the density is now good enough that people, recognize it as a real force. There's many of them.
Yeah.
And then if I just cut you off, like I don't really have to worry because I know you're gonna stop.
And the people planning that in the conference rooms, years ago or whatever, were thinking, well, this is great, but they weren't thinking about the fact that someone's going to look at another car and maybe be intimidated by the person behind the steering wheel.
Yeah.
And they're going to look at their thing and be like, I can step all over this.
Yeah.
That would never cross their mind at that point.
It's that story when you drive abroad, right? So there are different cultures depending on where you drive. And part of what you need to learn is like, how aggressive is everyone?
Yeah.
And if you don't match your own level of aggressiveness to the aggressiveness of everyone else, is basically you're very likely to be in an accident because people misjudge you. But also you're not going to get from A to B very fast. So what sort of the broader implications of very targeted increases in productivity, how they do or don't spill over into, oh my God, now we all can get from A to B much faster because we don't have the nonsensical human thing where someone on a freeway, brakes there because you're an irresponsible driver. You brake, everybody else has to brake, and then before you know it, you have like a big traffic jam. Of course, in a only AI future, that problem will have completely disappeared. But that'll be, I'm not going to be alive by the time that happens.